Hello and welcome to Sophie & Co. Meet Sophie Shevardnadze. Bahrain seems to have remained unaffected by the Arab Spring. However, local activists say it's because of government's heavy hand that puts down any dissent. What's really going on in the tiny isle kingdom? How did Bahrain manage to stay off the media radars? And what is in store for them?
In an Arab world gripped by revolution and wars, few countries have remained unaffected. At what cost? Bahrain has seen protest, dissidents jailed, and opposition brought to naught. Does stability mean political oppression in the Middle East? Could the fight for freedom usher in anarchy? Which sacrifice is worth the gain, and which path will Bahrain choose?
And our guest today is Maryam Alkhawaja, a human rights activist whose father is a prominent Bahraini dissident currently jailed following anti-government protests in 2011. Maryam, great to have you with us today. So, to be honest, it's really hard to understand what's going on in Bahrain, even when it comes to the form of rule. I mean, some say it's a dictatorship, even a tyranny. Others say it's a legitimate constitutional monarchy committed to reform with certain democratic values. How do you see it?
Well, I think that, describing it as a constitutional monarchy is very problematic when the constitution of Bahrain actually gives absolute power to the king. That means it's not really a constitutional monarchy. Yes, there's a constitution, but just the presence of a constitution within a monarchy system doesn't make it a constitutional monarchy. We're looking at a situation where we have a parliament in Bahrain made of two houses, but they don't have legislative or monitoring power. So overall, you can call it an absolute monarchy, which is oppressive.
So you would say it's a dictatorship, or you wouldn't go that far?
Yes, I would definitely say it's a dictatorship. When people don't have the right to vote, they don't have the right to influence the legal system, when there is no fair and independent judiciary, when the ruling family basically decides the ins and outs of everything in the system, whether economically, politically, or socially, then yes, you can definitely call it a dictatorship.
But you say protests never stop in Bahrain. Does it mean people aren't afraid of consequences?
No, I think the consequences are very real, and people know that the consequences exist. But it's because people know that stopping the protests now, would mean going back to a situation that was worse than what existed in 2010, before the protests started in Bahrain. And so people also believe in the demands that they're calling for. They're calling for human rights, they're calling for an elected government, and many of them are calling for the stepping down of the ruling family. And that's why they continue to protest almost on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. So since you've mentioned human rights activists have alerted to the ongoing human rights violations in Bahrain. Why has there been so little reaction from the international community, so little media coverage worldwide?
Well, I like to call it the inconvenient revolution. Bahrain, of course, is a country that's a member of the Gulf Cooperation Council. And the Gulf Cooperation Council has its tentacles basically everywhere in the world, whether we're talking security-wise or economically. And thus, internationally speaking or regionally, we're talking about a situation where most people don't want to take a stand against the ruling Gulf monarchies that exist today. And so politically, security-wise, and economically, it doesn't make sense for a lot of these countries who say that they support human rights and democracy in other places to actually take a stand when it comes to Bahrain. They would rather turn a deaf ear and a blind eye to the situation.
Mm-hmm. Unlike in Syria or Egypt or any other Arab country, the United States hasn't said much about Bahrain. Now, critics connect it to the strategic positioning of the American Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. Is that how you see it?
I think that the Fifth Fleet definitely plays a role in the U.S.'s position towards the Bahraini human rights situation, or should I say, the deteriorating human rights situation in Bahrain. But I think there are also other elements to it. You were also looking at the U.S.-Saudi relationship that has existed for a while now, and which is also based largely on economic ties as well as security ties. And so any stance on Bahrain also influences and affects the relationship that the United States has with Saudi Arabia, which is a relationship that they don't want to have any problems within. And so they would rather rather turn a blind eye to the human rights situation rather than risk having a difficult relationship with Saudi.
So was your February 2011 protest really an attempt of another Arab Spring episode? I mean, the difference basically being that the government managed to put the fire out quickly.
Well, I wouldn't say that they managed to put the fire out. They've definitely managed to put it down, but not completely out. And this is the reason why we're still seeing the protests today. But when the protest started on the 14th of February 2011, people came out in the streets and their demands were pretty similar to what we saw in other countries like Syria, like Egypt, and like Yemen, Libya, and others. And their demands was basically is that they wanted an end to the violations. They wanted to be treated with respect and dignity by their government, and they wanted to have a say in their government. Now, the Bahrainis were not calling for the stepping down of the regime to begin with. They were calling for a constitution that actually recognizes their rights as citizens. But it was after the very, very violent crackdown, which was, of course, held by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, that the Bahrainis said, well, if the government is going to respond to us with this kind of violence, if they're going to kill protesters, unarmed protesters, for going out on the streets and demanding something that is rightfully theirs to begin with, then the demand changed. It became from a constitution or a change in the constitution into a demand of calling for the king and his family to step down from power.
But can I tell you something, though, Maryam? Looking at the results of Arab Spring revolutions in other states, one can't help but wonder that maybe it's for the best that the revolution never really started in your country.
Well, I would disagree there on the issue of starting. That the revolution has definitely started. It just hasn't had the results that people have wanted to see yet, just like in the other countries, whether we're talking about Syria or Egypt. And I think that even if we look at the situation in Egypt, for example, or in Tunisia, it's a process. We're not, if we start believing that, a democracy that represents everyone, whether they're the majority or the minority, and that respects all citizens, will come overnight, then of course this is what the result will be. We have to understand that we're in this for the long run. We're in this knowing that it's going to take many, many years before people see the kind of government and the kind of country that they set out demanding. And so I don't think that the situation right now necessarily is hopeless. It's a part of the process to come into something better. But I think also a large part of it is because of the international consequences or the international responses to the different situations. In Bahrain, of course, we're seeing the responses of the United Kingdom and the United States towards the human rights situation, and the fact that the government in Bahrain believes and knows that they have international impunity is what allows them to continue committing widespread human rights violations. And in other countries, it's the same thing. You look at the international players that have played a role in the internal situations, and it makes sense why we are where we are in many of these situations.
But you are accepting of the fact that if the revolution actually takes place in Bahrain, that the immediate reality right after that will be probably dismay and anarchy before it gets better.
Well, I mean, what is anarchy? I mean, if we're looking at the situation right now where we have a crackdown almost on a daily basis, where we have people getting arbitrarily arrested from their homes during night raids, where we have children being picked off the streets, where we have people attacked with tear gas inside their homes, where torture is rampant, is that not in itself a form of anarchy? We don't really have a system that is, governed by a legal system. There are no laws. Basically, the police are free to do what they want. Government officials are free to do what they want. In my opinion, that is anarchy in itself.
So what's the most reliable number of the deaths since the breakout of the violence in Bahrain in 2011? Data differs and different sources give different data. What is your number?
I think the reason why there's a difference in the data is because of the kind of documentation that we're able to do. The Bahrain Center for Human Rights has documented more than 80 deaths in Bahrain caused by the use of violence by the government or the use of tear gas, excessive use of tear gas. Now, the reason why we're not able to document many other deaths that we know to be related to the situation, for example, tear gas deaths, and if we were to document them, it would be over 100 deaths, is because it's very difficult difficult in Bahrain, or rather impossible, to have a testing done on the body of the deceased after they are killed, especially if it's due to tear gas. And that's because the government controls who's able to do these kind of testings. Now, I believe in many of these cases, if we did have access where we could do this kind of testing, we would find that many of the deaths that have happened in Bahrain were in fact related to tear gas, people suffocating from tear gas or it going into their bloodstream, especially that it has toxic elements to it. But because we don't have that kind of scientific access to looking at the reasons of death, we're not able to completely document all of the cases that have taken place in Bahrain.
What about the prisoners? How many protesters have been put in prison? How many are still awaiting trial, or have all the convictions taken place already?
No, there are definitely a large number of people who are still awaiting verdicts, and we have a large number of people who have already received their verdicts and are in prison. According to the Bahrain Center's numbers, we have more than 2,000 political prisoners in Bahrain right now. Of course, if you look at the system, what the Bahraini government is trying to do is they're trying to label many of these prisoners as terrorists, and they believe that in doing so, they'll be able to get international justification for cracking down and putting these people in prison. Now, of course, if you look at the process of how these people are arrested and put on trial, wherein they're usually abducted from their homes, are subjected to enforced disappearance, during which they're usually subjected to torture in order to get them to sign sign confessions on the charges that have been put against them. And then they're put on a sham trial where most of the time the judge refuses to listen to the defendants about the torture that they endured for these confessions. And of course, usually the only evidence in many of these cases are the torture confessions. There isn't actually any other type of evidence that is being used. So the entire process in itself, from the day of the arrest until the day that the verdict is delivered and people are transferred to Joe prison where people who are convicted are kept, the entire process is wrong. There is no such thing as due process in Bahrain. And of course, it is in no way up to the standards of an international fair trial.
Dozens cases of medics arrested for helping protesters were also reported since protests broke out in 2011. Is it making doctors withhold help in case of need when protests are taking place these days?
Yes, of course. I mean, we're still looking at a situation where the hospitals are militarized in Bahrain. The Bahrain Center actually put out an extensive report on access to medical care and the situation of medical neutrality in the country. And we found that no matter where you're looking in the country, access to the health sector has become very much militarized and controlled by the Bahrain Defense Force of Bahrain. And we're looking at a situation where even as a regular patient, even if you have absolutely nothing to do with the protest and you're just going into the hospital for a regular checkup, there are cameras installed everywhere in the hospitals. And there's actually a complete breach of doctor-patient confidentiality because someone in the Ministry of Interior is sitting there looking at you being checked by the doctor. And so we're looking at a very, very dire situation for the health sector in Bahrain. Doctors are still targeted. They're not able, or if they do treat protesters who have protest-related injuries, they must notify the Ministry of Interior of this. And so many of the protesters or even bystanders who get hit because of the excessive use of force by the riot police are forced to go to underground secret clinics and be treated by doctors not officially or at home because they're afraid of going to the hospitals in Bahrain.
Does sound pretty gloomy. Now, after the break, what needs to happen to bring Bahrain human rights violations into the light of the world media? And is the choice only between the king or anarchy? Stay tuned.
At one time, I saved money to hire a hitman to shoot me dead from the next building, through the open window. I searched through the internet, typing things like, "I'm looking for you, I'm waiting for you."
I wrote, "I'm waiting for you, I'm looking for you." I didn't care at all what this man would be like. Deprived, disabled, ill.
I'll catch up with you.
No, you won't.
The battery has run out.
I love everything about him. I've grown to love every hair, every one of his fingertips. Him actually be healthier than other guys who drink beer on a bench.
I've always promised Anna that if she ever realizes it's too much for her and she decides to leave me, I will accept her decision without criticism, because it's her choice.
We're now outside two active camps at Guantanamo, where patients are force-fed. This comes after a massive hunger strike that returned the world's attention to the place that some have dubbed a gulag of our times.
Does the media lead us or we lead the media?
Privacy versus security. All right, your party, where's it going?
The questions that no one is asking with the guests that you deserve answers from. It's all on Politicking, only on RT.
More news today. Violence has once again flared up.
These are the images the world has been seeing from the streets of Canada.
Giant corporations rule the day.
Welcome back to the show. We're talking to human rights activist Maryam Alkhawaja about what's going on in Bahrain and what is so important for the international community to take notice. So I'm going to start out with a quote from a former Bahraini parliament member, Jawad Fayrouz, and that's what he told our channel recently. There's no clear vision within the government authorities on how to solve this crisis. Does anybody have a clear vision?
I think that there actually is a clear vision. It's that the Bahraini government doesn't want to reform. And they have no reason to, as long as they are not facing any kind of international consequences, as long as it's business as usual and they're able to entertain international events and buy arms and go to conferences worldwide. Why should they think that there's a need for them to change their policies or to stop the crackdown in Bahrain? Now, if we look at over the past 2.5 years, we've had the recommendations of the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry. We've had the recommendations of the Universal Periodic Review at the United Nations. And there has been an ongoing situation where we do have recommendations on how to make the situation better in Bahrain. It's that the government doesn't want to make the situation better. But I think that, if we look at the situation on the ground, it's not that difficult to come up with an idea of how to make or change the situation to the better. The stopping of arbitrary arrests, the stopping of abductions from people from their homes, the house raids at night, the excessive use of force, allowing people their right to freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. All these things, as well as releasing political prisoners, stopping torture, accountability, most importantly. If these things were to happen in Bahrain, definitely we will see a very great change in the situation on the ground. But like I said, our problem is that Bahrain believes that they have impunity internationally, and there definitely is a culture of impunity locally. So there's no reason for them to think that they need to change.
Many refer to the Bahraini turbulence as the opposition of the Shia majority and the Sunni monarchy. How important is the religious component in all of this?
Well, the sectarian discourse and framework that has become what is the Bahraini situation today is something that was promoted by the Bahraini government and their PR companies. Where the situation in Bahrain, if anyone was at the Pearl Roundabout protest, which I was personally, you would see that it wasn't about what your sect was, it was about being Bahraini. People were there from all different sects, from different religions, and what brought them together was the demands for rights and a government that represents everyone. Now, what the government did is in their crackdown, they launched a very, very sectarian crackdown. And they did this, of course, for two reasons. The first reason being that if they were able to frame the situation in Bahrain as being a Shia uprising rather than a Bahraini uprising, that to some extent, because of the media context with what the word Shia is linked to, which is Iran and Hezbollah, that would to some extent, in their opinion, give them international justification for the crackdown that they're carrying out. But also for a second purpose, which was to send a very strong message to the Sunni community in Bahrain that our problem is not with you, it's with the Shia, so you need to stay out of the situation. And of course, in creating a split between the Sunnis and the Shias in Bahrain, it's the elementary idea of political control. It's divide and conquer. If there's a unity between the Sunnis and the Shias and they're fighting for the same demands, which is representation and equality and rights for everyone, regardless of their sect or religion, if that unity exists in Bahrain, the government won't last very long. And this is what's very scary to them. And that's why they launched a very, very sectarian crackdown, targeting anyone who's Shia, demolishing Shia mosques, and of course going after people within the educational and work sector.
How have the Bahrainis reacted to a possible thaw that may take place between the United States and Iran? Have they welcomed it?
Well, I think to a lot of people, it's the reaction that I saw. Of course, there were many different jokes that were being made about the phone call that happened between President Obama and President Rouhani. The reaction on the ground was, well, maybe this will be a positive outcome for Bahrain. Given that the Gulf countries, and especially Bahrain to a large extent, have depended on the situation or the bad relations between the United States and Iran to promote their crackdowns against legitimate demands of the people by saying that the demands are linked to Iran. And so if there is a possible thaw between the United States and Iran, a lot of people on the ground, I believe, or from what I heard, were hoping that this would have a positive influence on the United States' stance towards the human rights situation in Bahrain.
But what do you think of Iran's new president?
Well, honestly, I don't really know too much about him to have much of an opinion. I think that initial steps that are good or seem to be good have been taken, which was the release of some human rights defenders who are in prison, including Nasrin Sotoudeh. And that is something that we all welcome in the human rights community. Now, the question is how long will it last? And is it something that will be installed within the system of Iran? Because if the system in itself allows human rights violations, then the human rights violations will continue, even if there are initial changes to begin with. But the system initially allows for human rights violations. What is needed is for the system to be fixed so that human rights violations cannot be allowed, and there is accountability for anyone who commits human rights violations or targets human rights defenders or civilians for practicing their rights and basic civil freedoms.
Do you expect more support from Iran, if not for democracy, then at least for a Shia rights cause?
No, because I mean the situation in Bahrain is not about the Shia rights cause. It's about Bahraini rights cause. And I think the expectations from Iran are the expectations that we have of the United States and the United Kingdom and Russia and all the other countries around the world. We expect these governments to have the correct stance towards the human rights situation. If the Bahraini government is committing widespread mass human rights abuses, then these countries need to stop doing arms deals with the Bahraini government. They need to stop doing business as usual, and they need to hold them accountable internationally for the ongoing human rights violations that they are committing.
Now, you live in exile. Are you seeing the fruits of your efforts? Is the Bahraini issue hitting home with the world leaders?
Well, I think the progress that we're able to make outside of Bahrain is going to take a long time, and we only see the results after some time. For example, when I first started going to the United Nations Human Rights Council, nobody spoke about Bahrain. Many people didn't even know what was going on in Bahrain. today, when you talk to people at the Human Rights Council about the situation in Bahrain, they have a good idea of what the situation on the ground is. And I think that that definitely is progress when we're looking at the situation of Bahrain internationally. So I think the discourse, the understanding of the situation definitely has changed. But it's going to take some time before we're able to actually exert pressure on different governments to take the correct stances towards the human rights situation. As you can see right now, for example, with the United Kingdom, they have one of the worst stances when it comes to reaction to the human rights situation in Bahrain, where they continuously excuse doing business as usual with the Bahraini government by saying that the Bahrainis are on a path of reform and that they're supporting this reform, when in reality on the ground what we're seeing is that the Bahraini government is moving in the very opposite direction of what reforms are.
But also, I have to notice that it must be very difficult for Bahraini human rights activists when you have United States and Saudi Arabia on the side of your opponents. What are your chances, really?
I would say that it's a very difficult situation. Like I've already mentioned, we call it the inconvenient revolution. And it's going to take a lot of work to be able to get to where we want to be. And of course, the situation of Saudi Arabia makes it a lot more tricky, given that there's a bridge between Bahrain and Saudi. And if Saudi decided that they don't like what the situation is coming to in Bahrain, they could very possibly send the military, like they've already done once before, and take control of the country. And in that situation, especially when there's no international reaction to an action like that, which we saw in the past when the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates sent military troops into Bahrain to help a government put down legitimate protests, there wasn't any real international reaction towards it. And so my worry is that if we do reach a situation where there is more progress made, and where people start to realize the demands that they've been making for the past almost 3 years now, what is the Saudi reaction going to be, and what is the international reaction towards the Saudi reaction going to be?
We've been speaking about how horrible the situation is in Bahrain, more than 100 deaths, more than 2,000 political prisoners, all these human rights violations. What else needs to happen to get the world's attention on Bahrain? What has to happen in Bahrain so that people start talking about it?
Well, I think there are many different things that can be done to bring attention to the situation. I feel definitely the continuance of the protests in Bahrain plays a big role in the situation, because as soon as the protests stop, it means that the government will be free to do what they want without much of a reaction on the streets. And so the continuation of protests definitely makes the situation a situation that can't continue for too long. But also internationally, we need to see things, for example, if we're able to get a special rapporteur on medical neutrality, that would look into the situations of places like Bahrain and report on the situation of medical neutrality in places like Bahrain, that would be very helpful. If we can get consistent statements condemning the human rights violations and move forward from just joint statements at the Human Rights Council to an actual resolution on the situation of Bahrain and the human rights, deterioration of human rights in the country, that would be very helpful. There are so many different things that can be done. Stopping of arms sales, like I mentioned earlier. If these things were to happen, I think we would see a change in Bahrain. But the question is, what is it that we have to do internationally as human rights defender to convince these governments that already say that democracy and human rights are the cornerstone of their foreign policy to actually act upon these elements and the ideas that they say are instrumental to their foreign policy?
Maryam, we're really short of time. Just really quickly, are you hoping to go back to Bahrain?
Yes, of course. Bahrain is my country, and they can only keep me out for so long. And so I will definitely keep trying to go back, even if it does come with the risk of possible arrest or a travel ban if I do get in.
And that's all the time we have for today. Our guest was Maryam Alkhawaja, Bahraini human rights activist and daughter of jailed dissident Abdulhadi Alkhawaja. Thanks for being with us. I will see you next time in the next edition of Sophie & Co.